Hello and welcome to The Papers, a look at what the front pages have in store for us tomorrow. I'm joined now by Claire Cohen, the women's editor for the Daily Telegraph, and Benedict Pavio, the UK correspondent for France 24. We'll bring them both in a moment. But first, a quick look at some of the front pages that we'll be looking at. In the UK, the Financial Times weekend edition looks at how China dealt with the coronavirus and how pressure on testing in the UK overwhelms the government website. Daily Mail says that Britons could be allowed to socialise with up to 10 of their closest family and friends in order to ease the lockdown pressure. The Independent asks whether different approaches to the easing of the lockdown may lead to a fracturing of the United Kingdom. Daily Telegraph suggests businesses are being secretly advised on plans to get Britons back to work and to restart the economy. And The Sun says that the Premier League football could be back within weeks with plans to televise all games and play matches behind closed doors. Meanwhile, The Guardian leads with a revelation that Boris Johnson's chief political advisor, Dominic Cummings, is on the scientific group advising the government on the pandemic, despite having no science background. The Express says that the Home Secretary will make a plea to those flouting social distancing rules after alarm at the number of people breaking lockdown measures. Well, let's talk now to Claire and Benedict. And Claire, let's bring you in first of all, the front page of the Daily Telegraph. Talk here of businesses being told that it's time to get back to work. Scientists telling ministers that the lifting of the lockdown could get underway by the middle of May. But I'm assuming if that does happen, it will be an extremely slow process.
You would think so, wouldn't you? I mean, this story comes, of course, ahead of Boris Johnson, we're told, returning to work on Monday and trying to take back control of the narrative, I think. You know, this comes after a week when we've been told that actually things like car usage and visits to shops have gone up. I think car usage rose by 3% this week. So there's a sense that it's not so much the government taking the public along with it, but the other way around. It's clear that we do need some sort of push to return to work, however slow that might be, to break the stalemate, to boost the economy, and to sort of learn to live alongside the pandemic, I guess, instead of hiding from it. But the language used in these briefings is being very, very vague, you might be surprised to hear. I mean, the story says ministers are saying there's scope for manoeuvre to business owners. I mean, what does that really mean? It also says that they believe firms might have been over-interpreted the social distancing measures. But is it any wonder when we've been bombarded for the last month with messages saying, stay home, work from home, or you'll die, or you'll kill other people? So just very mixed messages and no actual clear plan about how we can start to get back to work.
Benedict, do you feel there have been mixed messages here?
Yes, there are, because I think Matt Hancock earlier today even said that some shops had closed that didn't need to. So businesses, whether big, small, medium-sized, whether it's one person, 50 or thousands, need to have clarity. You need to plan. You can't just say you're opening tomorrow. And I think it is absolutely crucial. Of course, the main message is, stay at home, be safe, social distancing. But it is vital. It's not just a sanitary crisis, as we all know by now. It's very much an economic one. And in order to prepare for the after or the in-between, or certainly less of a lockdown, there needs to be absolute clarity. And that is sometimes lacking. Now, it could be because Boris Johnson, obviously, for health reasons, has needed to stay away. It will be interesting to see. Dominic Cummings is back since last week, and it will be interesting to see what difference, if indeed Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, comes back on Monday, how different that will be, not just when he leads briefings, but the core message and the preparation, as Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, and also the First Minister in Wales has been doing, to begin that journey, because it is not just policing by consent, but lockdown by consent.
Let's talk, Claire, about this story, also on the front page. Home testing kits running out in 120 seconds. I mean, part of coming out of lockdown is going to include, isn't it, increased testing. The government has set a target of 100,000 tests by the end of the month. And this website for key workers and their families is meant to go some way to getting the government towards that amount of tests, but it ran into a few problems, didn't it, really, today?
Well, it's not got off to the greatest start, has it? I mean, I'm sure the government will be delighted that it was so inundated with people. I think 46,000 people tried to book appointments. But of course, it couldn't handle it. It was overwhelmed. 'Twas ever thus, even though you thought they might have been prepared for it. And it crashed, or they took it offline, depending on which version of events you want to believe, within 2 minutes because the appointments were all booked up. But you know, there are 10 million key workers, all wanting, or many of them wanting tests, many of whom will be showing symptoms, will show symptoms. And also, the other big question around these tests is, of course, that it's emerged today there's no actual proof being required as to whether you are a key worker to book one, which suggests that some key workers might miss out. And the government has said they're taking it on good faith, which suggests to me that they're more focused on hitting this 100,000 target than they are on getting the right people tested in the next week or so.
But Benedict, one wonders, given that this has been going on for a few weeks, some people might be asking the question, why were these tests not made available a bit sooner?
A lot of people are asking that question, and I think despite the daily briefings, and we are really getting daily briefings, and we've had them from various ministers, some more frequently than others because they are clearly better performers than others, like Rishi Sunak, for example, and I think also Matt Hancock. But clearly there hasn't been that capacity. And now what's interesting about that 100,000 target is we learn in this article that it is not based, or in fact we learned from Chris Whitty, the CMO, Chief CMO earlier on today, is not based on scientific advice. But clearly the government having put out that message, or Matt Hancock initially having put out that message, they are racing to try and meet that 100,000 target whilst not spending any time explaining, as I was just saying previously, how, if not when, but how some of the measures that Nicola Sturgeon has, even if it was vaguely, starting on that journey of explaining what we can realistically expect. It's interesting, and I know we'll come back to that. In France, the finance minister, the president, the prime minister haven't always got things right, but certainly they have begun that journey and they already have a date. We think we know, we're about 10 days or 2 weeks behind France as far as the pandemic is concerned, but the figures are not that different. Let's remember that we're close to 20,000 deaths in hospital. If you add about 7,000 or 7,500 or more in residential care, this is absolutely huge. All the things, the individual stories that we're hearing, I think we all know some people now who are very closely affected by this pandemic, financially, personally, and friends, colleagues. It is a very new reality, and we need to address that new reality.
And just to let you know that my producer Sally has said in my ear that the website at the moment for testing has said that they've reached capacity for the day and they'll reopen tomorrow morning. Anyone watching at home who wants to get on that website needs to probably know that. Let's move on to the Independent, the online eye. Disunited Kingdom, will lockdown fracture the UK? Claire, this is basically talking about difference in approaches between England, Wales and Scotland in particular, what that will mean if restrictions remain in England and not in Wales and Scotland, for example. How different have the approaches been, do you think, and what impact has that had on the way people think about the three nations?
Well, we were talking about one nation until this week, and then of course Nicola Sturgeon published her admittedly rather vague framework for taking Scotland out of lockdown. Some people are calling it McExit. But this is something obviously that we haven't seen in England, so it started this conversation about three nations. I mean, she within this framework was suggesting even that there could be divisions within Scotland itself by region, which is a conversation that has been mentioned for England as well. I mean, I don't think anybody really could expect that somewhere like London would maybe come out of lockdown restrictions in the same way that rural areas would do. But there is this sense of fracturing now, and Arlene Foster was talking on BBC this morning, and she did make a point of saying that she wouldn't take Northern Ireland out of lockdown any sooner without the approval of Number 10. But they've had far fewer cases. So it's not beyond the realms of imagination to think that she might want to do that sooner as well. So I think we could see increasingly this fracturing of the three nations.
But Benedict, what do you think? How's that going to work if there are no borders between Wales and England and Scotland and England?
With difficulty, and I think all four nations know that. I think this increases even more the pressure. There's the testing, there is to wear a mask or not to wear a mask, there is where to get your test. And I think now there is, could one nation, it's like a race, it seems. And I think this fracture, at a time when actually countries and the world needs to be much more united, is quite revealing. And I think this, in a sense, I don't want to push the analogy too much, but shows a certain political fracture anyway within the United Kingdom. Merriman, if you're allowed me, may I just say something that happened today? And that is a very regular reviewer of the papers, Lynn Fallswood, our colleague, former BBC Watchdog presenter, who I've done paper reviews, I'm sure Claire has and others have. There's a real sense of sadness that we've lost somebody who was just a sterling journalist, a fantastic campaigner, and I couldn't go through this pay per view and not pay tribute to her and wish the very best to her family, amongst
Absolutely,
them.
yes.
Her son Nick and also her husband.
Absolutely,
John
Benedict, yes,
Stapleton.
completely. And Lynn suffered a massive stroke, I believe, and very sadly passed away quite suddenly at the age of 72. So, of course, we do pass on our condolences. She was a regular contributor on the papers here on BBC News and one of our favourites, and a wonderful woman and consumer rights activist as well. So thank you very much, Benedict, for that. Let's move on now, if we can, to Daily Express. I want to bring you in here, Claire, because the headline here talking about Priti Patel warning selfish rule breakers. The key thing here, we touched on it earlier, is that it seems a little bit that this whole lockdown fatigue is starting to take over a little bit in the UK, and the hot weather is not helping. Do you think people who are breaking the rules right now are thinking along the lines of, well, you know, the numbers are diminishing, I can do what I want?
I'm not so sure it's I can do what I want, but I think people are hearing in the daily press briefings talk of the R, the spread rate being below 1, which keeps being reiterated. The rhetoric about the Sombera having been squashed. You know, people are rightly being given the idea that we have, to some extent, got this under control, and without a plan in place for how lockdown might be eased, it's really little wonder that they're starting to take things into their own hands. And disillusionment with the government is increasing over this. There was a YouGov poll out today saying that the approval rating, I think, had fallen 6 or 7% from last week. I've no doubt that we'll see that continue to drop week after week, especially if ministers are going around calling people selfish.
Do you agree with that, Benedict? Is that why people are starting to perhaps feel slightly more relaxed about things?
Yes, I think it is. And of course, this is testing a lot of people's willpower, their mental health, homeschooling, which I'm not having to do, but I think is a real challenge. There's no let up. I was reading an article earlier today about how work-life balance has really gone out the window. I mean, parents are being parents, teachers, and many things, nannies besides. So it's very, very testing. And yet we know that the British public understand the need for a longer lockdown. As I was saying before, they it's not just, they need to be spoken to, I think, in a more clear, direct way. I happen to think, and that's not a political opinion, but that Rishi Sunak is quite good at doing that. It will be basically, Boris Johnson has got a very tough job. He's going to come back to a virtual parliament, a new opposition leader, Sir Keir Starmer, who did an excellent PMQs on Wednesday, a very different world. And of course, it will be interesting to see how the fact that he's had this illness quite badly, how that affects his decisions on some level. Also, the fact that he has got his companion, his fiancée, who is pregnant and who will also rely on NHS, by whom Boris Johnson also was saved. So he's got a kind of re-entry into orbit. The election, doesn't it feel incredibly far away? And I think the fact that that general election was run in such a presidential way, which Britain isn't, he's a prime minister, not a head of state, that's the Queen. I think it's really been extraordinary for Boris Johnson not to be at the forefront of this battle. I won't call it a war, but it is, after all, the biggest plague, pandemic in a century. And a century ago, they didn't have 24-hour news channels, social media, and the speed with which information travels, which has effects on shares, airlines, shopping, all kinds of things. So it will be really interesting, and I wonder what briefings Boris Johnson has been getting and how he will re-enter the forefront of his job and of British politics at this extraordinary testing time.
Claire, let's bring you in here and talk about the Daily Mail front page. Choose 10 lockdown friends and family. Ministers are apparently looking at whether to relax the strict stay-at-home advice and let small groups of households cluster together. It'd be almost like BT's Friends and Family scheme. Do you remember that, where you used to name 10 friends and family? I don't know how many there were, and you'd get a discount on calling them. Well, apparently government ministers considering letting you or allowing you to socialise, meet for meals with these 10 people. I mean, really? You think that's going to happen?
I mean, I thought the message was that we were all in this together, not that we were being asked to pick favourites amongst our friends and family. Although actually there's nothing in the story that says that they have to choose you back. So presumably if I wanted to pick sort of Phoebe Waller-Bridge and Rihanna, that wouldn't be beyond the realms of possibility. Who knows?
Who would you pick, Claire, if you could?
I think Phoebe Waller-Bridge would be at the top of my list, probably.
It's supposed to be friends and family, Claire, not your ideal dinner party guests.
Sorry, Mum and Dad.
What about you, Benedict? Who would you pick for your 10 friends and family?
Well, 2 or 3 of my closest, nearest and dearest. Of course, my parents, my brother in Paris, certainly. Can I include a dog? I don't have one.
Listen, this is the BBC. You can include any pet that you like. We love animals here on this
I
channel.
would love to have a dog. I just don't lead that kind of life.
I want to bring in the FT. We have to talk about President Trump. We have to talk about disinfectant being injected into your veins and curing you of coronavirus, which was the suggestion that President Trump made at his press conference last night. Claire, to you, I mean, it really has caused a lot of alarm. And it's, companies, disinfectant companies and people like Dettol coming out and saying, look, don't ingest us. Incredible times.
I mean, isn't it extraordinary that in 2020 we're sat here and that companies like Dettol, as you say, are having to tell people not to ingest disinfectant? I mean, it is beyond the realms of the ridiculous into the dangerous. I mean, we just saw President Trump ahead of this programme giving tonight's briefing, and I think that was about as conciliatory as he ever gets. It was quite subdued, a lot of talk about home testing kits and emphasis on the safety and the validity of those. But I'm afraid that does nothing to wash away what he said last night. He said tonight, actually, the world is watching us. Well, they really are now, because this has made international headlines all day. Every expert from here to eternity coming out and calling it dangerous advice. I mean, the point being that ingesting bleach will cure coronavirus, in that you will no longer be alive to have it anymore.
It's done nothing to wash away what he said last night. I like what you did there, Claire. I like that a lot. Very briefly, let's bring in our last story, Benedict. The London Marathon, it was due to take place this Sunday. I'm not sure whether either of you were signed up for it. No, okay, fair enough.
I did my one and only marathon, and that was last year, the Moonwalk.
Oh, good for you.
I don't know if I'll do another one. I'd love to think that I'm going to. Yes, so this is a story about the fact that maybe it'll only be elite runners. Come on, that is not in the spirit of the London Marathon. I'm sorry.
Do you think that they should perhaps just cancel the whole thing and just have next year's in April, or how are they meant to do it? I mean, there are sponsors. It's a big race.
Look, the reality is that nobody, apart from God, knows where we're going to be at that time. So yes, it's a horrendous dilemma. Actually, I quite like the 2.6 miles and the fact that we're all in this together in that sense.
Claire, what do you think?
There's no way of planning this.
I think it's incredibly insulting. I mean, there are upwards of 40,000 runners who have been training for this for months and raising money for it. And obviously, it's really crushing for them that they can't run it and they may not be able to run it in October now. And, the other point is that this is the biggest charitable fundraising day on the calendar. Last year, it raised £66 million for charities that are really struggling at the moment. And to say that people who have worked that hard to raise that money to help charities that mean a lot to them, that they might not be able to run it, leaves a really bitter taste, especially when, as Benedict just pointed out, they're being asked to do this 2.6 challenge tomorrow in their gardens at home and raise more money.
OK, well, Claire Cohen and Benedict Pavio, it's been an absolute pleasure to have both of you on the programme. Thank you so much for your input this evening. And thank you for joining us for the papers this hour. Thanks again to Claire Cohen and Benedict Pavio. Sport is coming up in a couple of minutes, so do stay with us. Bye-bye.